Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Laborfest, for this presentation and putting it on this sunny day, this sunny Sunday. I'm calling this talk Slave Labor and Free Labor in the Golden State. And it involves the history of slavery in California. We don't think about slavery in California. We think about slavery much more as a North-South issue in the United States. And I also want to talk about what happens when labor is free. And with that, I'm going to just use as my example the strike on the Transcontinental Railroad when 8,000 Chinese railroad workers on the Transcontinental Railroad went out on strike. And that was the first strike that I'm aware of for equal pay. And it's a story of what happened up in the Sierras and how it was organized by people, by men who had been brought under contract to work in the Sierras and build the Transcontinental Railroad. So I just want to talk about the difference for people when they're free and when they're enslaved. This map that came out in 1858, and it's the map that took our country into the Civil War. These were the assumptions about where there were free states and where there were slave states. The map is wrong. It's shrunk and it's distorted, I think probably with a purpose. The slave states are in gray, and if you notice, Texas is also a slave state. We don't often think about Texas as part of the slave states. In fact, there were 200,000 enslaved blacks picking cotton by the time of the Civil War. The pink states, and they're shrunk, the map is shrunk, were the free states. And note that in making this map in 1858, as we're heading into the Civil War, they're including California as a free state. Probably the most important part of this map are the green areas, and these were the territories. And one of the struggles of the Civil War was what was going to happen to the future of our country. Would it become a slave country or a free country? And these were territories where each area, state by state, as they entered the Union, would either become slave states or free states. So in terms of our notion of freedom and of democracy, these undetermined territories would be critical as to our future. What's missing from this map is not only the size, which is skewed, and that it upends our north-south view of slavery in the United States. But what's missing is that it only refers to enslaved African Americans, and it does not include enslaved Native Americans or enslaved Chinese women or enslaved Alaska Natives, who we'll talk about briefly, who have been transported into California for the otter trade. And that's where slavery and the environment come together, of Alaska Natives who were brought in here by the Russians to slaughter otters. So this map takes us to old assumptions about who was enslaved, black and white, black versus white people, north versus south, and it includes other racial or ethnic groups. It excludes other ethnic or racial groups who were enslaved in California. So my title of my book, California, a Slave State, is both a title, but it's also an argument that California was, and if we look now at human trafficking, still is a slave state. This is a slide, an image of an enslaved African-American miner. What I didn't know growing up in California, going through the California school systems, was that we hear about the gold rush. I did not know that plantation owners from the South brought out overland or through the jungles of Panama between 1,500 and 3,000 enslaved African Americans from the plantation South to work for them in the gold mines, in the diggings up in the Sierra Mountains. Gold is discovered in California in 1848 near the ranch of John Sutter, Sutter's Ranch. Sutter was a slaveholder of several thousand Native American people who he discovers there's more money in owning and renting out Native Americans than there is in ranching or in gold. So gold is discovered in 1848, and people are coming from all over the world to pan for gold. In 1849, California holds a convention to write a constitution to turn itself into a state. And in the Constitution, California's Constitution, it says slavery will never be tolerated in California. Well, this was a loophole because tolerate is not a legal standard. It was a buyout, and it was an intentional buyout written into the Constitution. They didn't mean it. At the Constitutional Convention, there were 44 white men and 8 Mexican American, mainly very wealthy ranchers, who in fact held what they called peons, working for them. And there was no assumption that California would in fact be a free state. There was also no way that the United States wasn't going to take California into the Union. Right away with the gold rush, $1.5 billion, and that's in then money, $1.5 billion is being sent east in gold to banks, to insurance companies, to shipping companies, to the government from the gold that's coming out of the state. They could have written any constitution they wanted. They did take a year to debate it. There was no way they were going to turn away the $1.5 billion. Just as we talk about money, the multiplier that I'm using is 30. That there are a lot of apps now that'll say, what's this worth now compared to what it was worth then, whether it was a bar of soap or gold or costs or salaries. But pretty much for the mid to late 19th century, there's a multiplier of 30. So if it was $1.5 billion in 1850, that's $30 billion of gold that is funding the United States, that's coming out of California. There was no way that California was not going to be admitted into the Union. And so they do this buyout by saying slavery would not be, quote, tolerated. If you remember from your old SAT days or your high school days, the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise was a trifecta of how what was going to happen to the United States going forward. And there were 3 parts of the Missouri Compromise. The first is that California had to be admitted as a free state, free in the sense of no slavery. The second was Utah and Nebraska could choose whether they would come into the Union free or with free or enslaved people. And probably the most dangerous for our destiny was the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. This was the deal, that Congress would and did passed the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, and that meant that any black person anywhere in the country could be targeted, seized, and sold in the state, even though there were thousands upon thousands of free blacks in the territories and in the North. They were vulnerable to being seized, claimed as runaway slaves, and sold as human beings. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is probably one of the most dangerous pieces of American legislation. As I talk about this book, people say, can you define what is slavery? And it involves, here's a list: the capture, the kidnap, the sale, the right to assault, the right to rent out human beings, the right to forcibly transport human beings from one place to another, and we think about that now with human trafficking, of the forcibly moving people to own them and to work them. It involves women and men. It involved forcible indentures where there's like a contract, but the contract involves the right to buy or sell or force the labor of another person. It involves not being paid for the work that you do. It doesn't have to involve what we now think of with African American people as chattel slavery, which means not only are human beings, our bodies, our reproductive bodies, our working bodies, our sexual bodies being bought and sold for a profit, but with chattel slavery, our children were also owned by the person who owned them. That doesn't always happen in California. In fact, it rarely happened in California. We'll talk about that, of chattel slavery. But in the South, that's what happened. After slavery, after 1808, which ends the African slave trade, happens, and no more enslaved Africans are to be brought into this country, who was going to produce the ongoing generation of enslaved people? It was women. It was enslaved women on the plantations whose bodies and whose sexual and reproductive bodies were owned. And so their children, their quote, their issue, was also owned by their slaveholders. We're on Angel Island right now. We're part of Laborfest. And I think as we talk about the history of slavery in California, we need to keep in mind that in many cases, there was the history of men and the history of women, that there are two paths in this country. As we look around Angel Island today, we'll notice that there are women's dormitories and men's dormitories. The testimony books were different for women and for men to produce, to defend their right to enter this country. So I think that divide between men and women is going to weave through with commonalities and differences in this story. As we think about the history of Chinese people in California, as we're on Angel Island, where a huge and disproportionate number of people who were held here were Chinese Americans. There are 3 acts, and this isn't a legal talk, but just 3 acts that shaped the lives of people who were coming here from China. The first was the Page Act of 1875, and the Page Act bans the entry of lewd women. And lewd women was a metaphor, a synonym for Chinese women, lewd or debauched women. So they are banned from coming. If you ban women from country, it's ethnic cleansing. Without women, there aren't going to be kids. There aren't going to be families. There are not going to be babies. And so it was a very deliberate, intentional act of ethnic cleansing. We talk more about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That's the first act in American legal history to ban a people by race. And then the last act that I want to talk about is the Geary Act. Every 10 years, the Chinese Exclusion Act is re-upped. And it's re-upped in 1892, and they add that every Chinese person needs a photo to carry on their person, a photo identity card. Right now, we are, in some ways, targets of that act with the photo ID card that we all need to get on an airplane. The real ID card, you see signs up as you go through security at an airport, are you carrying real ID? But the Geary Act of 1892, which required Chinese people to carry on their person at all times a photo identity card, a certificate, that was the first time our country had an internal passport. We don't have internal passports. Many of us have worked or traveled in places where if we're traveling on a visa, we better have it with us, on us at all times. Our country has never had a tradition of an internal passport except the photo identity card that came from the Geary Act of 1892, when over 100,000 Chinese people, of the 110,000 Chinese people in this country, joined together to refuse to be photographed and carry on their person a photo identity card. We're here on Angel Island. Angel Island, the fort of Angel Island, morphs into a detention center. They call it an immigration center. And it followed the earthquake of 1906. In 1906, all of the immigration papers in California, in San Francisco, burned. There was no way somebody could prove that they were the child of a legal resident. And there is a rush of Chinese people into California claiming legal status. And at first they're held in warehouses, and finally the idea comes to put them on Angel Island and process them here. And that was our first detention center. My dad came through Ellis Island, and that was a processing center. It was like a massive immigration processing center. It's an amazing place to visit if you haven't been there, but it was not a detention center. My dad was one of 11. There were 7 who came with him and his mom and dad from the area. It was Russia, now it's Ukraine, and they were processed at Ellis Island. They were inspected, their papers were inspected, they made sure that they didn't have pink eye, and there was a telegraph station on Ellis Island where your relatives were telegraphed, your family's been processed, and you can now meet them at the docks. That is not the history of where we are today. If we look at the period of the 19th century, the southern states, and the story of slavery in California, the southern states always planned to extend slavery to the Pacific. They always wanted and intended that the areas of New Mexico, of Arizona, of Texas would become slave states. Tobacco and cotton had destroyed the soil of the South, and they knew that to expand the slave economy, they had to take it elsewhere, and the intention was always to take it to the Pacific. So when gold is discovered, African Americans, enslaved African Americans, were marched across the country to work in the gold mines like this man. And there's several versions of this photograph. They're hard to duplicate, but sitting above him are white folks in a wagon looking down on him, and they're his owners. There are stories now that I've been able to find written by enslaved African Americans who were taken to California. For example, a guy named Alvin Coffey had 3 owners. His family is kept in Missouri so that he won't escape in California. They're held, in effect, hostage in Missouri. Alvin Coffey was rented out. His owner decides that he can make more money renting Alvin Coffey out to other people than using him on his own behalf. And he says to Coffey, but on your free time, you can work for yourself. Alvin Coffey makes finding gold dust, $5,000, and his owner takes the money that Coffey had made on his own time, gives him back $600 for himself. But he keeps reminding Coffey, I've got Mahala, your wife, back on the plantation. He never tells Coffey that he is a free person, that once he's come into California, he was a free man. Coffey knew, and he writes about this, that he could flee in the redwood forests, in the rivers, in the Sierra Mountains, but his owner still has Mahala and his kids back in Missouri, and Coffey doesn't flee. He goes back to the South with his owner, with his money, and he says, here's my money, I earned this in the gold rush, and his owner refuses it. He wants to keep Coffey and the money. He sells Coffey to another plantation owner. Coffey's brought back out to California, works again and again and again, and finally is able to buy his wife and kids. He brings them back to California. They open a school for African American kids and Native American kids in California. This is an ad that I don't even like to read out loud, but it begins, Negro for sale. This is the kind of ad we would think we would find in Louisiana or New Orleans or Alabama, of ads of human beings being advertised and sold. But in this ad, this is from the San Francisco Express. This is ours. This we have to own. Tragically, we have to own this history of, and the evidence, amongst all kinds of evidence, is ads like this. There was other kinds of resistance. Having children, I think of as a form of resistance. It's a faith in the future. It's a faith in our ability to continue on as people. Stealing food, learning to recognize hound dogs that were brought out from the north, trained hound dogs that are brought into California to chase runaway enslaved people. The Indian boarding schools in California that suddenly we're hearing more and more about, and we'll talk about that. When they came for Indian children to take them captive into these boarding schools so they could send them out as unpaid workers, parents hid their children. There's lots of evidence of moms hiding their children in logs, like in open, rotted redwood logs, so the recruiters from the boarding schools wouldn't take their kids. There are stories of sharing food and information. There are stories of how Native Americans who were held at the Spanish missions learned to ride a horse. There wasn't the horse in California. The horse comes with the Spanish, but learning to ride a horse gave you all kinds of freedom, including take the horse and flee. I think that as we think about slavery in California, we have to think about money. Slavery costs, and slavery creates debts. Right now in California, there are 2 reparations commissions. One is run by the state, one is run by the city of San Francisco. And what the reparations commissions are saying to us is that slavery costs. It cost money to be owned. And it's the first time in American history that there's been a price put on what it meant to be an enslaved person. And the California Commission, the California Reparations Commission, has put a cost on slavery that is owed to the descendants of enslaved people, and it's $850 billion. And that comes from the loss of labor, the loss of earning, the loss of housing rights, the loss of education, the loss of wages accrued over time to our children, to the descendants of slaves. Our first senator from California was William Gwin. William Gwin is going to represent this free state in the Senate. He was a plantation owner from Mississippi. He came to California from Oregon, and in Oregon he was part of the movement to ban black people from Oregon. And it passes in Oregon when it is still a territory. Black people were banned from staying in Oregon. And if you stayed, if you were black in Oregon, before Oregon becomes a state, you face 6 months in jail and being whipped 60 times. So William Gwin, our first senator, comes and he's part of the convention to write our Constitution. He comes with this really perilous background. What enslaved people brought to California that they didn't expect to find here was free blacks. Free blacks have come from the north. They come from Maryland, from Delaware, from New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, where there were thousands of free blacks. And they want to come here for the same reason everybody from around the world wants to come here, which is the chance for adventure and to get rich and to find gold, get away from home, get away from mom, be young. And a lot of them were veterans from our war against Mexico. And they are marching back from Mexico, where we win our invasion of Mexico. We take the top third of Mexico. The war is over in 1848, and all of these men are marching back when they hear gold is discovered in California, and they turn around and they come out to California. So free blacks who've come to California for gold do not expect to find their brethren. They don't expect to find enslaved blacks in California. Enslaved blacks in California do not expect to find free blacks who are going to help them, who are going to help them find their freedom, and who are going to create a Pacific Underground Railroad that takes them from San Diego, LA, San Francisco, and helps them escape, who will snag them from the riverboats where they're being held by their owners. And to start our first civil rights movement, this meeting of free and enslaved blacks in California is an historic, and they didn't expect to find each other. Many enslaved blacks who are brought out here are never told that they're, in fact, in a free state. One of my favorite parts of this story is a lawsuit that I found, and it's called Sire v. Gwin. Gwin is our first senator. And Gwin brings out from his plantation, Senator Gwin, an elderly black couple, George Sire and his wife, and we do not know the name of this unknown woman, Mrs. Sire. And he decides they're too old to pick cotton, but they'll be great domestic servants for him. And he sets up house in San Francisco with the sires. And he tries to make it in the gold rush. Well, he doesn't get reelected because he's kind of a jerk and also a slaveholder. And he doesn't get reelected. He's going to go back south. But he figures the sires are too old and too decrepit to be worth anything back on the plantation, and he dumps them in a black neighborhood in San Francisco with nothing. And the black people in San Francisco find this elderly couple, and they say, you were free from the moment, because this is legally a free state, you were free from the moment you crossed into California. And they file a lawsuit. And it's one of the first, as we're a part of Laborfest, it's a working people's lawsuit. They are suing for back wages for the time they worked in California as free people. And they claim that he held them in bondage and he held them unpaid. What they're demanding, thank you guys. You were great. What they're demanding is 2 years worth of wages because Gwynn had, quote, appropriated their goods, that is, their bodies and their services. And they calculate their labor at $50 a month for George and $55 a month for his unnamed wife because there were so few women in California to do domestic work. So her work is actually valued at more than his. It totals up to $2,282 in the lawsuit, or in my calculations, $64,000 in current money. The court argues that had the couple been white, there would have been an implied promise to pay them, and Gwynn would owe the sires for their work. Turns out that an all-white jury concedes that yes, in fact, slavery was outlawed in the state, and this lawsuit was testing that. But they say that California could, in fact, force men and women to work without wages. The Gwynn, our first senator, concedes that he had, in fact, paid no wages to the sires, but he'd provided them food and shelter. He says that he treated them like a parent treats kids, where you don't have to pay your kids for the work that they do around the house because they perform labor, quote, out of love or duty, like relatives, and this isn't the case, who anticipate an inheritance. Well, clearly the sires were neither Gwynn's heirs nor his children. But the jury also rules that the sires should have known that they were living in a free state, that they could have left Gwynn to work for someone else. They could have left California. In fact, says the jury, they worked for Gwynn, quote, voluntarily as they had formerly done. The U.S. District Court says that Senator Gwynn still owned the sires' bodies and that if he takes them back to Mississippi, quote, their former relation would revive and they would have to work for him back in Mississippi without pay. So what this lawsuit establishes, that men and women transported as slaves into California lacked the free standing as free workers, and they could not testify, and this is in the California Constitution, blacks and Indians, and later they would add Chinese people, could not testify in court. When did slavery begin in California? There was, in fact, no mass tribal slavery in the California tribes in California. Sometimes individuals who were captured in a skirmish were held and traded or forced to work as part of the tribe. But with those individual exceptions, There was no institutional slavery in any of the Pacific tribes along the coast in California. The first slaves in California begins with Junipero Serra, who invades California with 100 Spanish soldiers and 8 fanatical priests in 1769. The soldiers don't want to be here. They would rather be guarding enslaved people at the mines, the silver mines in Peru and in Mexico, where they would get a chunk of the loot from just being present at the mines. There is nothing for them. The Spanish invade with a bull from the Pope and an order from the Spanish emperor to conquer and convert thousands of California Native Americans, seize their coastal lands, and ultimately they build a chain of 21 mission plantations. But the issue was not only to convert Native Americans to Catholicism. These huge and successful agricultural plantations were also to feed the workers at the silver mines in Peru and Mexico. They didn't want the Native Americans working at the silver mines to have to take time off to raise food or to divert a population. The food to feed the silver mines of the Spanish Empire was to come from here. It was also, as Spain is moving from the south, Russia is moving from the north with the otter trade, and the goal of the Spanish emperor was to block the Russians, and they do up in Sonoma County, what's Sonoma County, Marin County, and there they build Fort Ross. This is what the missions looked like. This image was taken with the invention of the camera. There was no camera in 1769, so this image was probably taken in about 1840 or 1850. So this wasn't our 4th grade mission project where kids are building things that look like Taco Bells. Our kids were raised in DC, and so they didn't build missions. They built the Supreme Court out of sugar cubes, and Capitol Hill out of sugar cubes. I think my husband enjoyed very much building these. I don't know how much the kids did, but he built the Supreme Court out of sugar cubes. But in California, there was the 4th grade mission project. It has recently been abandoned. When I was a kid, that I ground acorns, like the quote, the Yangna Indians did when I was a kid in California schools. Nobody told me that you couldn't eat acorns unless you got all of the tannin out of them. They were nasty. I couldn't picture, made me kind of think the Indians were really weird that they ate this stuff, but they didn't eat just ground up acorns. And the 4th grade mission project, which gave this illusion of play, of easy labor, of indulgence, is now over. So this is not what that was not what the missions looked like. They didn't look like the arches and the Taco Bells. The first slave revolt in California was in San Diego, where the tribe that was captured were the Kumeyaay Indians, who were captured to work in the San Diego mission, the first mission, and the Kumeyaay who lived in the mesas around San Diego and who lived in the coast, now like in La Jolla and so forth, where there were waitresses on roller skates. That was not what was happening. At the time, the Kumeyaay surround Mission San Diego, and they burn it to the ground. They kill the head priest, Father Jaime, and they torch the mission to the ground, and they free all of the Kumeyaay people who were held at the San Diego mission, never to return. I didn't learn that even when I taught at UC San Diego and went to quinceañeras and weddings at the rebuilt San Diego mission. I had no idea that this was the site of the first massive slave revolt against the Indians, against the missions. I didn't know that at Mission Santa Barbara, La Purísima, Santa Ynez, that there was a coalition of mission slave revolts where the Indians took over the missions, the priests fled, and then the tribal people fled east into the Tules, where the Yupik Indians were waiting for them. This was planned and took them further and further east into the marshes and the Tule marshes in order to find their freedom. I didn't know that the Russians had sailed across the Aleutian Islands for the otter trade, and they thought they were looking for the generic route to China, but instead they find otters. And when they've decimated the Alaska Native tribes, and eviscerated the sea otter. The sea otter has 1 million hairs per square inch. It is the softest, furriest fur pelt in the world, that when they've decimated that, they turn right and head down the Pacific coast, and they land in Humboldt, what is now Humboldt County, and they keep moving down south, south, south until they build Fort Ross, Fort Ross, in Sonoma County, as the plantation to send out Alaska Natives for the fur trade. This is an image of an Alaska Native as later our explorers traveled with the camera, like Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir traveled with the camera. The Russians traveled with watercolorists. And this is a watercolor by a guy named Louis Choris of an Alaskan Native. And it's an interesting photo because at the top, the guard, the frame of the photo, is the Alaskan ship. And here they're hunting. These are actually seals. They're not sea otters, which was the food of the Alaskan Natives. California's very first act, very first act, in fact, before we even legally become a state, was called the 1850 Act for the Government and the Protection of the Indian. This very first act legalizes the slavery of Native Americans. This is a very vexed picture. It's a very painful picture. The time of the gold rush is also the launch of the genocide, the California genocide of Native Americans. What the Act for the Protection and Government of the Indian did was legalize the forced indenture of Indians. Because of the genocide, Native American women and children were on the run from the torching of all of these villages that were to remove the Native Americans from the villages, to slaughter the Native American men who were envisioned as warriors. And there were women and children on the run. And the Act for the Government and Protection of the Indian was to supply a labor force of vagrants who were on the run. And under the Act, you could hold an Indian boy until he was 25, and you could hold an Indian girl until she was 35. That could very much have been the total lifespan of a Native American refugee. It's important, as we talked about gendering this history, that there was a very low female population in California, aside from Native Americans, and assault was built into slavery in California. There are all these letters from Junipero Serra back to the Mother Mission in Laredo, Mexico, saying this whole plan is going to fall apart because of the rape of the Spanish soldiers of Native American women. We have got to stop the rape of these women. And there are no letters back that I have found from the mission authorities to Junipero Serra saying what they were going to do about it. In the missions, there was a room called Muñeras, which was the female dormitory. And nightly in the Muñeras, the Spanish soldiers and the priests could come in and pick the woman they wanted for that night and rape her. And the overseer of the Muñeras would force the other women who weren't picked that night to sing to drown out the sounds of sex and torture that were coming in this planned way of conquest. Part of this was to buy off the Spanish soldiers with these women, so because they didn't want to be here to begin with. The Native Americans could not prove that they were free. They had no access to the legal system because they couldn't testify. And so Native American girls were sold from the reservations and from the military forts and from the jails. Low-end jailers at small town jails could sell Native American prisoners to the new ranchers. The other form of slavery were Chinese American girls. Chinese men came here freely, the way people came from all over the world for gold. And Chinese females were kidnapped from the port cities of Guangdong and brought here under contract to be sold into slavery in San Francisco. This picture was taken on Jackson Street, which flows into Grant Avenue. The girls were brought here by the thousands in padded crates. Some of them who were dressed in more elaborate clothes were forced to hide opium in their sleeves, and they were sold from the docks in San Francisco. Our docks here in San Francisco were in fact slave docks, and if you weren't sold or obviously pre-contracted for, and you weren't sold from the dock, you were taken into Chinatown and sold from a room called the Queen's Room in San Francisco, and then kept in these caged brothels on Jackson Street. Interestingly, Jackson Street sort of connects Chinatown with the business district of San Francisco, and there were rows of these caged brothels where the girls were kept, and they serviced up to 20 men a day. I cannot imagine that. I cannot imagine in effect, the rape of 20 times a day, where the pay was kept. The madams or the pimps were actually often the wives of the Chinese merchant class in San Francisco. Will stay out of order. At the turn of the century, the turn into the 20th century, between about 1890 up through the 1950s, but mainly from the end of the 19th century into the 1910s, 1920s, 1940s, is the rise of the Indian boarding school that we're reading more and more about now. And our knowledge is we're in debt to Canada and the Supreme Court investigations into the Canadian boarding schools. California passes a law, along with every other state, that Indians were required and entitled to have public education and had to go to school. But there were no schools on the reservation, and this was a setup for the Indian boarding schools where the kids are taken in. There were 12 boarding schools in California. The kids are taken into the boarding schools and instantly turned out to work in the new orchards, the orange groves, and the girls were sold into the new hotels, the tourism industry, and the program was called the Outing Program. On day one, and the model was the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, on day one when your kids were taken into the boarding school, their hair was cut, they were dressed in the scratchy woolen clothing, the boys. The girls were dressed in kind of cotton shifts that looked to me like our images of girls and women on the plantations, the southern plantations of these loose cotton shifts. And they were never allowed again to speak their native languages. And the programs were called the outing programs. When I first read the word outing, and outing means something different now, than it did then, but the outing programs were literally to send the children out. And there was an outing matron at every boarding school, and she would do the match. She was like a slavery employment agency to match the Indian children with the jobs they were going to do. This is from Riverside in Southern California. This is a classroom where the Native American girls are being taught how to iron. These are Native American children, little children who are grubbing for potatoes. This is also in Riverside at the Sherman School. The photograph is from the Library of Congress. And this is a class photo from Sherman, Riverside, California, where the kids are wearing, somebody's written on the photograph the number of the kid, and you can obviously see the depression, the fear, the lack of health in these children from this class portrait at Sherman School in Riverside.
Why does one say dead?
Because it was written after, after the fact. These numbers, the kids aren't wearing them. I think they were written in some kind of wax crayon at the time. It's a really I'm glad the kids are gone now. It's a painful, although I think our kids need a different education. I think it's not my decision to make what these kids have wandered into as tourists to see. Moving backwards to the period of the 1850s, the slavery in California also marks the birth of the carceral state that we heard so much about during Ferguson and so forth. What happens in California is that with the gold rush, captains and crews are bringing out ship after ship after ship of people to work in the gold rush. And the captains and the crews decide there's a lot more money in gold, or so they think, than in transport. And they abandon 400 ships in San Francisco Bay. And these ships are dangerous, and they're rotting, and they're bobbing in the bay, and they're also worth a lot of money. California, like every other state, is assigned to build a penitentiary. And there was a lot of crime during the gold rush, petty crime. A loaf of bread sold for $18, a jug of milk sold for $12. People didn't want to take the time to farm, to dairy, to be bakers. They wanted to go up to the gold rush, and stuff was expensive, and there was a lot of petty crime. California decides to build a penitentiary very early on. Early in the 1850s, the legislature gives the contract for $100,000, and remember my factor of 30. This guy named James Edsel gets the contract to build a penitentiary, and in his contract is his right to own the prisoners. So as we think about convict labor now, he was given the right to own and work the prisoners. What he does is he takes at least 2 of these ships bobbing in the bay and converts them into prison brigs. We think about the prison brigs going from England to Australia, England to New Zealand. They were in San Francisco Bay. And Edsel, there are 2 ships called the Euphemia and the Weiban, sailing around, and he's sailing these ships around San Francisco Bay and renting to his profit these ships that he's converted into dungeons. This is the ship from Sacramento. It's kind of the best picture I have. It was called the LaGrange. And so they build these prisons atop of these ship hulls. And at first, Edsel's sailing them around the bay to build the sewage system of San Francisco. He rents them to wealthy privateers to build the mansions. He's renting them to the city to build streets in San Francisco. Finally, the legislature says to Edsel, build the damn prison, and you cannot do this to rent them out to private people, and so he builds San Quentin Prison. The prisoners have to build their own prison, and they build San Quentin Prison on a quarry in Marin County. It doesn't make sense. Alcatraz makes sense for a prison. It's an island. They can't escape. Building it in Marin County made no sense, but I think that they chose the site because at the same time they buy the land for the quarry, Edsel buy the land for the prison. Edsel buys the land next to San Quentin Prison where there's a quarry, and they're going to use the rock quarried from his land to build, that's what builds San Quentin Prison. So he's got the whole deal tied up. What happens at San Quentin is that no longer allowed to rent out prisoners to the city, they build factories in the basement of San Quentin Prison. And the most profitable one, they're furniture factories, they're door factories, privateers, but the most profitable one is a jute factory. And now's the time to think globally that we are importing jute, which is like burlap, from India. It comes to us from Calcutta, and it comes raw, and at San Quentin Prison is the jute factory, and they're weaving bags for wheat. If you don't put wheat into something, it's going to fly all over the place. You can't sell it. And California agriculture is very quickly all about wheat. It's our first major crop, and it needed to be transported in these burlap bags. And the jute factory in San Quentin Prison is going to sustain the new California agriculture, selling them these bags. And the prisoners were required to stand at looms. There are 1,000 steam looms in the basement of San Quentin Prison, and a prisoner was required to stand on a 12-hour shift weaving these bags, and which would be sold to California farmers, and they were not allowed to move from their loom, and they were not allowed to talk. I know there's no way I could stand for 12 hours a day and not move and not talk, not me. And if they did, they were tortured. This is early waterboarding. This was torture in the basement of San Quentin Prison, where a prisoner was waterboarded until death. They also would put a prisoner who talked or moved in a bathtub and stick the new electric prods into the water so the prisoner would jerk around and suffer. This image is an example of the kind of resistance that free and enslaved people put up in California. As I've mentioned, neither Native Americans, Chinese people, or African Americans had the right to testify. Across the country, and I didn't know this, there were colored conventions. I'd never even heard the word before. There were hundreds and hundreds of colored conventions where thousands of black people would get together, often in churches, the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal churches. They would meet, and this is where they organized for abolition, they organized for the right to vote, they organized for the right to hold property in their own names, and in California, there were 4 colored conventions. I had never heard of this. 1855, 1856, 1857, and then one after the Civil War. And they were all for the right to testify. And I keep reading through these minutes thinking, where's the demand for freedom? Where's the demand for abolition? What I didn't get is that if you couldn't testify and enter into evidence your freedom papers, or enter into evidence the Constitution of the state of California that established your right to be free, you were enslaved. And I can tell you that when I went to, women aren't supposed to cry at work, but there were 2 times I sobbed writing this book. And one of the times was when I was in Sacramento, and I found these petitions that came out of the colored conventions in San Francisco and Sacramento for the right to testify. And there are 8,000 signatures on these petitions before the Civil War. How did people in a state that had no railroad, that had no roads, how were they able? I mean, now we sign a petition, at midnight in our jammies, we'll sign on to anything. But how did people collect 8,000 petitions, which is about 5,000 more, 4,000 to 5,000 more than there were black people in the state at the time? So white people are supporting the right for African Americans to testify, and there are piles of these in our state archives, and just touching them. And if anybody's a teacher, I urge you to take the kids, send the kids into the archives so they can have an intimate one-on-one feel and read of the archives for freedom and the right to testify, and they win. By 1858, the ban on black testimony and Indian testimony is over in this country, and it was a huge victory. In terms of talking about slavery, we're living in a slave state now. That California is the top state for human trafficking in the country. California is the 5th largest economy in the world, and San Francisco is one of the top cities for human trafficking in the country. This is how human trafficking works now. Girls are marked. This is a girl who has been trafficked into the sex trade, and so she has a barcode tattooed on the back of her neck. And people in the human trafficking movement in California are now training police officers and healthcare workers, rape crisis centers, but any place where a girl might get away from her captor, how to identify a girl who's being trafficked. And one of the ways is the tattoos. A very popular one is to tattoo a crown on a girl to mark that she is the subject of this owner. But I chose this one because it's a barcode and it's very, very visible. So today, the sex trade is active. It's less visible than it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, if you stopped at a rest stop or a big truck stop or a gas station, you would see girls being sold from the gas station or the truck stop. Now it's all online, and you can pretty much get anything you want online by sexual preference, by what kind of deed, what kind of act, what kind of race of the boy or the woman that you want. It's all available online. Up in Humboldt County, we're very proud of a young woman who was trafficked, who I spent a lot of time with and interviewed her. She goes by the name Elle Snow, and Elle was trafficked. She escaped from a motel. She was freed, and she started a local NGO called Game Over for people who were trafficked. And what she started doing was training. Her focus was on police officers because they're out, they're about, they see stuff, and training healthcare workers. Those were her two target audiences: how to identify girls who were trafficked and how to tell their partners, you can't come in with your girlfriend, quote, girlfriend, into the examining room, and to make that a requirement. We used to think, oh, it'd be good if our partners came with us to medical exams. They're learning that is not always a good idea, so that a girl can have the confidentiality to explain what her situation is. One of the most courageous groups of people now working against sex trafficking are flight attendants, because that's where people are being transported. And if you walk into the bathroom of an airplane, you may find, and also in airports where men can't visibly go into a women's bathroom, there are now signs. The one I saw flying out to California was written in Mandarin, in Spanish, and in English, and in Arabic, with a phone number of where to call, and just to stay there, get somebody to make a phone call. There's a phone number. Don't leave this space, and someone will come rescue you. Or versions of help with a phone number for help. So I think it falls to us to start to notice wherever we work, to notice where trafficked people may be. We spend a lot of time up in Humboldt County, and while I totally support legalization, we now know that there's a lot of traffic in the cannabis grows, and that people are being trafficked out of the detention centers in San Diego, in Juarez, at the border, and being trafficked into the marijuana grows. And I think we need to de-romanticize and demystify pot, and to think about who's actually growing this, what it's doing to the environment with the fertilizers and the insecticides, the animals that are eating the plants. But we're not asking, as we look at this fancy packaging and in dispensaries, wherever we go, we're not asking who's actually growing this. At Humboldt State, it's now Cal Poly Humboldt, the state of California has funded the Cannabis Institute. It's a state-funded program, and I've gone to some of their meetings, and it's just really interesting to me that I was the only one, and I don't mean to, because this is not my main area of research, but somebody needs to be doing the research into who's growing pot right now. And there were people, I was just surprised at who was there. There was La Leche League on whether or not the molecules of cannabis pass through breast milk into babies. So La Leche League was very concerned about the popularization of pot. I was trying to look into labor, and the issues spread across. It certainly enters the judicial system, who's being busted for it and who's not. So I think it's something that we have to think about. One of the biggest forms of the difference, I wanted to talk just very briefly, because I'm coming to the end of my time, about the difference between free labor and slave labor, as we're here at Laborfest to honor labor. I just came from the Rural Chinatowns Conference in Utah, and which was really focused on all of the Chinatowns where the Chinese were rounded up and driven out, and also on the towns that would not let the Chinese people be rounded up and driven out, which is the topic of driven out. But at the conference, that one of the issues that I really wanted to raise was the notion of free labor, that 10,000 Chinese men are brought voluntarily to California with contracts to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Crocker, Stanford, Huntington, big California names are the four key investors, Strobridge, in the Transcontinental Railroad, and they couldn't find white workers. Crocker freaks out. This is Charles Crocker, not Eddie the banker Crocker. Charles Crocker freaks out. He can't get labor. Abraham Lincoln wanted a transcontinental railroad, and the contract goes to Stanford, Huntington, and Crocker to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It's going to go from Sacramento, and then they're going to meet the ones coming from the east at Summit Point, where I went 2 weeks ago. And what happens is that there are 10,000 Chinese railroad workers working under contract. They're getting less pay than white workers. White workers were getting about $60 to $75 a month. The Chinese workers are getting $35 to $40 a month. The white workers are living in cabins that are built on top of railroad flatbeds so that they would move along as the tracks get built and the cabins go east with the housing goes east with the road. The Chinese workers are living in tent cities or shacks. The one thing that the Chinese contract had that was majorly to the advantage of the Chinese railroad workers was that they could bring their own cooks, they would have Chinese food, and most important is that they would have tea bearers. And if you think of the Chinese image of in the 19th century of people carrying poles, shoulder poles with baskets hanging down, on the railroad, that was boiled water for tea. So the white workers are drinking contaminated water out of the creeks and out of the riverbeds and in the melted snow where people were defecating, urinating into the rivers. That's what the white workers' water was. The Chinese workers with the tradition of tea and boiled water are healthy. They're not getting Shigella, they're not getting Giardia because they're drinking tea. They go on strike. There was a landslide. A huge number of Chinese railroad workers die in the landslide, the avalanche that's coming down. They're living in snow tunnels in the Sierras, blasting through the granite of the Sierras, digging with picks. They're moving 1.8 miles a day. I mean, the work that went into the Transcontinental Railroad, and they're left out of the honor, they're left out of the pictures of this, and they go on strike. And I just want to end with thinking about the difference between free labor and slave labor, that 8,000 of the 10,000 Chinese railroad workers go on strike. What Crocker does is he brings in guards and he locks them in these tent cities and he starves them out. The strike lasts for a couple of weeks. They've strategically planned the strike. They're about to do the final blast through the tunnels in the Sierras. It's June. The snow is finally melting in the Sierras, and they plan the strike for June. And they're working with the Chinese merchants who've snuck leaflets into the food that's coming up to satisfy the contract. They've snuck these leaflets out that are distributed up and down the tracks announcing the strike. Crocker obviously knows it. After this landslide, the Chinese railroad workers decide this is our moment, and they announce a strike. They leave the tracks, they go back into the tent cities. Crocker surrounds the tent cities with these guards and starves them out. And ultimately, they lose that strike. But what we've learned is that this is the first strike I'm aware of for equal pay in the United States. And it's one of the first strikes for the 8-hour day. They wanted 8 hours when they're working in the ice tunnels and 10 hours when they're working outside the ice tunnels. It was a phenomenally courageous strike, and of course, it blasts open every stereotype that we have of Chinese people, of docile, subservient, all that junk. That this was strategic, well-organized, and a formidable strike with very, very high demands. As we talk about the strikes for the 8-hour day, we don't credit the Chinese railroad workers for their contribution to those demands. So I just want to end with the fact and the reminder that there is still human trafficking going on, that slavery is enduring in our state. This was an Egyptian girl, Shamima Hall. Shamima was taken to Riverside. Maybe we should just let Orange County secede. But she's taken to Riverside. She's taken into slavery to pay the debt of her sister. Her sister's enslavers didn't like her work, and so the parents give the employers Shamima in lieu of her sister. He's corrupt, he's deported, this wealthy Egyptian family, and they move to Orange County with Shamima, and a neighbor notices Shamima as a nanny in the park, and she wonders, why is a child taking care of other children? Who is this brown child taking care of other Egyptian brown kids in this park in Riverside, California? And they call social services. Social services sweeps in, they arrest the parents who end up going to jail and who have to pay a huge fine to Shamima for the years that she was forcibly transported and never paid. Shamima is put into foster care, a series of families, and her foster families, take her winnings from her trial. So she ends up isolated, destitute, without the winnings that she courageously fought for. But she writes a book, and it's called Hidden Girl. And it's a young adult, it's written for young adults. It's a really easy book to read. It's amazing to teach and to prompt conversations and our sense of human trafficking. And Shamima is now a leader and an advocate against human trafficking. Shamima Hall, this was a staged photo. She was kept to sleep in a little shack built on top of their garage, and she returns to it, and it was still there after her Egyptian owners were arrested. I'll end with this image. It's of a Chinese woman named Yoklin. Yoklin was an enslaved prostitute. She is married out of prostitution, I believe, to one of her customers, and she climbs the steps of the courthouse in Sonora, in California, and says, I want to write an affidavit. And in this affidavit, she's saying, my husband Charlie, which is a generic derogatory name for Chinese men at the time, my husband Charlie is in jail, and I am writing this affidavit. And she creates the form, she creates the genre. I am writing this affidavit to declare that I am a free woman and no man may ever own me again. Thank you.
Thank you.